So my previous videos, my introduction and introduction to Hermeticism, were actually based on articles that I've wrote. So thanks to some critique from a friend of mine, it doesn't appear as though they flowed very well. So consequently, I'm going for a slightly different tack this time. So with that in mind, the series of following videos aims to explain the current predicaments that have led to and consequently have resulted in the present day situation that we find ourselves in. So I'll not be delving into too much detail at this point until I've kind of provided the basic overview, so that we can kind of come back and cover these topics at a later point in time. So this particular video is going to concentrate on religious and ancient stories of creation, other potentials as well as going into the scientific knowledge that we've gained as a species of our actual beginnings. So in a similar essence to the introduction to Hermeticism, I'm going to go through just quickly a point already mentioned and then continue from there. So in the beginning there was a word, and the word was God, which is an allegory, as I've already discussed, referring to the all-encompassing energies of the universe, which are graded. So we know of consciousness as having various different grades within a scale, and to me these scales kind of stem from the extremes of love and fear. Love being obviously the highest grade of the grade of consciousness, and fear being the lowest form of it. So when you're in love, your heart typically tends to race, which is the same as when you're fearful. However, I don't know if you feel the same way, but personally, it almost feels a lot heavier when your heart is racing due to fear, as opposed to love, where the heart is racing and it kind of feels a little bit more euphoric, and it doesn't feel as though there's a weight, a burden upon you. So, with that in mind, I'm going to move on to the story of creation from the biblical standpoint and explain how it's based on geometry. And eventually I'll come back to this and relate it to actual scientific knowledge that we have. So the story of creation is this story of geometry, and the resulting form that is described within the Bible is known as the flower of life. And this structure, this geometric structure and form, is found throughout our history. The Temple of Osiris in Egypt has depictions of this shape, and many Christian images also have this shape hidden within them. It's linked to Kabbalistic teachings, which I'm going to go through in much more detail when I come back from this series of videos and start focusing on Hermeticism again, as Kabbalistic teachings are essentially a Hebrew occultic science. So I will go through those at a later point, but for now I'm just going to continue along this geometric story. So one of the opening lines of the Bible, I'm using King James edition, is, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." So to me this pertains to matter not having existed, and we are literally in a void. And essentially God creates a three-dimensional axis. So you've got your height, or your height or your length, if you will, your depth and your width. And if, for argument's sake, we say that he goes 3 centimeters up, and then 3 centimeters down, and then 3 centimeters in each of the other directions, so we have a 6-pointed axis. Essentially, the next part is moving upon the surface of the waters, or the face of the waters, pertains to the idea of uniting all of these points and giving them equal kind of proportion, which would essentially result in a sphere. So as we know, water is formless, and it molds quite easily to its physical parameters. So, for instance, when you're filling up the bath, you stick something in it, and the water moves around it. Obviously, there's the old age adage of Archimedes sitting in the bathtub, and obviously having that eureka moment. The same thing can be said essentially if a person submerges themselves in water, the water rises around them. It doesn't, just kind of absorb into them or whatever, although it does to some degree. It changes its form around your form. So if a solid object gets sat within water, it will change its form, and therefore the level of the water will also change. So in this argument, I'm kind of pertaining to the idea that God moving upon the surface of the waters is the idea of him creating this spherical form around an initial parameter. So in terms of hermeticism, we would look at a straight line as a male energy and a curvature of any kind representing a female energy. But I'll come back to that shortly. So essentially this is an allegory. So in the next part, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light, that it was good. And then God divided the light from the darkness. So this to me, once again, describes the creation of duality, these male and female energies, as well as many other opposites. As mentioned in the introduction to hermeticism, the thematic principle of gender is essentially not to do with gender as in male and female as we typically see it. It's more to do with opposites and this duality. So this also potentially pertains to the idea of this whatever this was, this primordial atom splitting, and the energy that was kind of released from that within this single point of the void, containing just this incredible amount of dense matter at one point, and all of this energy, when this original point finally split, just expanded rapidly and continually, obviously to this day. So just a quick side note, Marty Leeds explains this in various different videos to do with gematria, which is a form of numerology. And he also points out in other videos that certain key phrases within many religious and occultic doctrines result in understanding of hidden meaning that can be derived from these words, usually in the form of maths. So tetragrammaton, he goes into great detail on, and he actually links that directly to pi. In fact, most of his work kind of delves into the discussion of how does pi relate to the English language, and it's fascinating stuff. So check Marty Leeds out at some point if you get a chance, because his work kind of links with Freemasonry and various other different secret societies as well, and goes to show how creation can be linked to these mathematical ideas hidden within the Bible as well. So he goes into this in much more detail. I am going to cover some of this stuff at a later point, but again, Marty Leeds is essentially an expert on this field, so check some of his stuff out. So I'm not going to go through the 6 days following the initial creation story from the biblical standpoint. I'm only instead going to go through this from a geometric view. So the first day, he essentially creates another sphere, and by doing so he creates this, well actually no, even before the first day, he creates this secondary sphere, this splitting. So what you end up with is these two spheres overlapping at the radius. Now, because of this point, you end up with this area that's shared between them, and this shared area is what's referred to as the Vesica Pisces, or the womb of the universe as it's commonly known. And this shape is the shape of the eye. If you were to tip it on its side and rotate it, 90 degrees. And it's also the shape of the opening of penis. It's also the shape of the vagina as well. So once again, you can see the duality and association to generation within this shape, hence one of the reasons why it's referred to as the womb of the universe. And this is a key kind of point within sacred geometry. So by the end of the first day, there are two spheres, and as I say, they overlap at the radius. So throughout the following 6 days, you end up with another sphere being added. But there's a problem in terms of the Flower of Life. It only depicts 7 spheres, and we have 2 by the end of the first day. So to kind of rectify this commonly misinterpreted fact, is that when you're looking at the Flower of Life, you're looking at a 2-dimensional form. So just quickly going back to the Bible, and God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he had rested from all of his work which God created and made. So the important point to note regarding this is that on the 7th day, from a calendar perspective, which I will mention later on, there is actually this point of rest, which is actually referring to the returning to the original position, i.e. that central sphere at which he began, which is common as the starting point within the Flower of Life structure itself. However, this time it's actually on top or behind the original sphere, which actually results in us having 8 spheres, 1 hidden behind the central sphere, which now gives us a 3D form. It gives us 8 spheres, 1 hidden behind the back end. Now I'm going to come back to this point later on. Temporarily, I'm going to go into the beginnings from a scientific perspective of the universe. So obviously, I've mentioned already that the atom was split. Whatever this atom was, it could have been much larger. It could have even just been the fact that it contained such a large amount of mass, and we don't even know if it was an atom. I'm just referring to it as an atom for argument's sake. So once this initial splitting had occurred, which Marty Leeds refers to as the splitting of the walnut, if you will, because he depicts it in a similar way as it's just literally a walnut being split open and half, and it kind of relates into the yin yang, so on and so forth. As I say, I'll come back into all of these things in much greater detail after I've given a basic overview, which will be this series. Then I'll start going into more individual topics that are held within these videos. So from this, the four fundamental forces that we know in physics of gravity, electromagnetism, strong nuclear, and weak intermolecular start to come into play. The formation of molecules being dealt with from strong nuclear and weak intermolecular. The charges associated with these things, and the force of attraction and repulsion being governed by electromagnetism, and gravity essentially being the resulting of space-time, and so on and so forth. So these four forces created the format for everything. All of this dust that was created, all of this matter that was contained within the universe, began to behave in the ways in which it resulted in the cosmos being the way it is to this day. And obviously the continuation of that, because stars die and things renew, so on and so forth. The dust essentially coagulates into planetoids and stars and so on and so forth. I'm not 100% on all of that yet myself, as research is constantly ongoing, but I will cover this in more detail at a later point anyway. So now that I've mentioned the beginning of the universe from the biblical literature, and I've just given the overview of how the cosmos was created from a scientific standpoint in a very, very vague and very top level kind of view, I'm going to go into some in-depth science for the beginning of this planet itself. So in the earliest days of the Earth, there were a lot of volcanoes. The Earth was a very, very hot temperature because of this, and the atmosphere itself had virtually no free oxygen. The atmosphere itself was primarily made up of carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and there was also a lot of phosphorus and potassium and so on and so forth, these elements that are now absolutely pivotal to life, but at the time would have probably prevented it from being able to form, particularly oxygen being the main issue. So comets and meteor showers, we know, occurred in vast amounts at some point. I think it's something like 35 million years ago, was when all of this really started kicking off. And at this point, essentially, these meteor showers and comets terraformed the Earth by bringing amino acids and other essential molecules to the Earth, which would later be used for life, hence essential coming from the word essence, linking to life itself. So these essential molecules arrived from the cosmos itself, essentially. So we aren't sure what preceded, whether it was genetics or metabolism, though both the scientists Haldane and Oparin convergently came to the conclusion that an organic soup, the primordial soup as they refer to it, existed during this time, as the abundance of organic and inorganic molecules such as I mentioned before, potassium, phosphorus, and these amino acids and lipids, which are essentially just fats, as well as obviously the building blocks of sugars, because carbon was probably in quite a large amount of abundance. We're all now in this sea, this primordial soup that would have been amongst the land masses of volcanoes and such. So Haldane and Oparin did this research in 1924, and as I say, this is the kind of the conclusion they came to. And they essentially coined the term biopesis, which is the process of living matter evolving from self-replicating but non-living molecules. And they suggest that this led to the formation of primitive cells, which does imply that primitive metabolism was the precursor to genetic material, or rather requirements for genetic material. So protoplasm was essentially the first living thing, if you will. Though similar to viruses, it can't really be referred to as life. It was more just a case of the membrane enclosing what we now refer to as cytoplasmic fluid, with very basic organelles, I'd imagine, and a very basic form of genetic data. So cell membranes were probably the most important part of the initial stage, because cell membranes obviously differentiate self from non-self, if you will. So if you imagine your own body, going back to the second law of the Hermetic principles, correspondence as above, so below. Obviously, we discussed it more from a cosmological perspective and from a quantum mechanic perspective. But even within your body, you are an organism, but inside of you exists cells, which are essentially their own living thing as well. And you're comprised of multicellular eukaryotic cells, as they're referred to as. But I'll come back to cell types in a few minutes. So these cell membranes are created through phospholipids, which are essentially two fatty acids, primarily carbon and hydrogen, and phosphorus. It's referred to as a phosphorus head and these fatty acid tails. And these phospholipids exhibit a trait known as hydrophobic tails and hydrophilic heads. In other words, the tendency is that if possible, and where possible, the phosphorus heads will try to face the water whilst, or liquid, and the tails will try to keep themselves away from liquid. As a result of this, there is a tendency for phospholipids to actually form a bilayer, and this is why your cell membrane works, because the phospholipids face the internal cytoplasmic fluid, and then the tails link with other tails and essentially create and have another phosphorus on the other end, preventing liquid from the rest of your internal workings from having any involvement in this central layer that's now been created within these phospholipids. So this bilayer occurs, and this would have engulfed some of this primordial soup, which now contains essential metabolites, monomers, if you will, so monomeric sugars, amino acids for proteins, and fats as well. So there's this theory called the RNA world hypothesis, in which scientists have begun to postulate that essentially the first genetic material was RNA. And RNA is actually used within the body to this day. We use RNA now for the processes of transcription and translation, in which translation occurs after transcription, and transcription is essentially the copying of the genetic data. So specific enzymes known as DNA helicase unwind the DNA strands and allow nucleotides, which consist of a phosphorus again, with a carbon backbone, and then these bases, which are given the letters of A, C, G, and T. And I'll go into those at a later point. I'm not going to break those down just yet, if you'll excuse the pun. So RNA actually works nowadays differently, because it has A, C, G, and U, I think it is. It replaces thymine with uracil. But that's, again, something that I'll cover at a later point. So the idea is that this RNA began to form, and presumably the purpose of this was to kind of keep a track of what was successful and what wasn't successful, because as far as I can tell, most of these things would have been reactions that would have occurred spontaneously, and that's the same view that most scientists have, is that all of this was random. Now, I'm going to come back to that point, because I personally don't, I dispute the idea that it's completely random, because, well, reasons I'll get into shortly. But essentially this RNA would have formed, and this would have allowed, much in the same way that RNA works in the translation phase within our bodies today, is it binds with a specific form. There's multiple different forms of RNA nowadays. There's messenger RNA, or mRNA, which is the part of the form of RNA that kind of copies the genetic code, but it copies it in reverse, and it then goes out of the nuclear center, the nucleus itself, and moves into the cytoplasm itself, where there are these structures called ribosomes, which mRNA binds to, and then the ribosomes are held within the cytoplasm until tRNA, or translational RNA, comes in. And tRNA will bring with it amino acids, and will have the reverse of the reverse, if you will, the reverse of what the mRNA is encoded. So essentially, it will be an exact copy in terms of what's referred to as a codon, which is a 3 base pair string, if you will. And these tRNAs will come in and they'll bind with the ribosomes, essentially randomly, but it will be based on these respective relations to what the mRNA has. So if the mRNA has an A, a C, and a C, then it's going to bring with it a U in place of thymine. So as I say, with RNA, it's thymine is replaced by uracil. So normally A binds with T and C binds with G, and vice versa. In this case, so you've got A, C, and C on the mRNA. You're going to have a U, a G, and a G, and this is going to code for a particular amino acid. And as a result, this amino acid will come in, and then the ribosome will bond with other mRNAs, and eventually you'll end up with a polypeptide chain. So much in the same way, I would imagine RNA being incredibly reactive, as opposed to DNA, which is stable. Hence why it is our genetic data to this day. It's kind of an evolutionary thing. Primitive organisms, when they were first forming, when probably excuse me, probably before they could even be called life, would have had this reactive capability. And as a result, it stands to reason that the exact opposites would form alongside of it. And then that would essentially split and allow for self-replication. So another property of cell membranes is that they can actually create what's referred to as a vesicle, which is like a bubble. And from this, essentially, you end up with 2 from 1. And our bodies do this when metabolites are trying to get into the body from the blood. They will hit the cell membrane, and they will activate this ability of the cell membrane to essentially fold inwards, encapsulate these molecules that are on the outside, and then the phospholipids around this will then enclose, and they will get smaller essentially for the time being. But this vesicle will then travel into the body, which will be its own phospholipid bilayer. So the same can be said in terms of initial cell division in prokaryotic or pre-prokaryotic or protoplasmic, if you will, organisms. And so as a result of this, this gives us the idea that because of this RNA, and also which would have contained the basics on how to essentially create proteins and various other things, more complicated molecules from the original metabolites. This is how essentially life would have progressed, and how things would have gained greater functioning, and obviously form, as I've mentioned before, is where function is derived from. So either way, cyanobacterium, a bacteria capable of photosynthesizing, must have come about at some point, it's postulated, as this is the only kind of organism that we know of that's still around today, at the least, that is capable of photosynthesizing. It's capable of doing the same thing that plants do, but obviously it requires a lot less machinery, if you will. And as a result, it's believed that some form of cyanobacterium, whether it was a primitive form or whatever, created this gradual increase in free oxygen, which then increased the possibility for life to form, and for more complicated forms of life. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about how scientists see this as a random process, and however I dispute this, it's because of the fact that it's not entirely random, in the sense of that there is only one possibility for life. Many other possibilities may have occurred, but these resulted in essentially failed attempts, cul-de-sacs, if you will, an evolutionary cul-de-sac. And it was only when specific things occurred, such as the cyanobacterium and this structure of RNA being created, that allowed for this progression to occur in the first place. So whilst yes, it was random, in terms of how you perceive it, with sensory function. In terms of if there is a divine plan or whatever, we can't argue at this point whether or not there were any underlying principles which meant this was always going to happen, because planet Earth is in a position where life is possible, whereas if we were even a few 100,000 miles away from where we are in terms of orbiting the sun, life wouldn't be possible at all anyway. So whether it's random or not, I guess depends on looking at everything within the cosmos as well as looking at everything that's happened on Earth. So I'm not going to continue down this line of inquiry, if you will, at this point. I'm just going to pass over this onto the next part. So mitochondria, which are incredibly important in the human body as they are involved in creation of energy, they were originally formed, now it is believed, by phagocytosis, which is essentially the engulfing of other entities, if you will, by some form of cell. So if, for instance, I'm going to just refer to this as an amoeba at this point. So phagocytic amoeba engulfs a bacterium, which allows that amoeba to harvest energy from the bacterium that's now inside of it. It's essentially a mutualistic relationship. It's called mutualistic symbiosis, in which this bacterium is providing energy to the amoeba, but the amoeba is actually going out there and engulfing metabolites which allow that bacterium to do what it does in the first place. And this is also part of the reason why mitochondria have DNA, or their own form of DNA, and that's because bacterium are obviously prokaryotic cells, which are primitive cells, if you will. They're unicellular organisms, and they don't have a nucleus, but they do have nuclear DNA held directly within the cytoplasm. So it's highly possible that that's the source. And again, these things are disputable, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that this is how it happened. And it is also likely that chloroplasts used by plants in photosynthesis formed from a similar interaction, possibly with these cyanobacterium, or something that was similar to it but primitive compared to modern day cyanobacteria. Not that modern day cyanobacteria are particularly complicated in comparison to obviously mammals and eukaryotic creatures as a whole. So there's much more to the original formation of life, and as I say, most of what we do know is based on speculation, and derived from what we know at this point in our kind of our understanding. So we're doing a lot of guesswork, and there is also something lacking within this. As I say, geometry kind of hints at this in its own right, and I'm going to get onto that shortly. Obviously, there are laws and principles that we understand now, so Hess's law, which I'll cover at a later point, and many of the other laws of thermodynamics tell us about reactions, and obviously we know that there was a lot of heat at this point. So the likelihood for reactions to occur back then would have been much quicker than today in terms of atmospheric reactions. But still, there is much more to understanding how genetic data was accumulated to the point at which we eventually became consciously questioning of ourselves. So I'm going to skip over that for now, as we can postulate on that at a later point once I've gotten down to some of the other points that I wanted to make. So prokaryotic cells eventually developed into eukaryotic cells, and again, this is probably from forms of phagocytosis again, where we are absorbing mitochondria in our case, and plants are absorbing both mitochondria and chloroplasts. And eukaryotic cells lead to multicellular organisms typically. They don't always. You can have eukaryotic single cells, so unicellular organisms that have eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are kind of defined by having more evolved genetic data, and so on and so forth, and they're usually more function within them than prokaryotic cells. Bacteria and archaea, which are a much more specified form of bacteria, typically very, very efficient, but they have very limited functions, and that's because their forms are very limited. So eukaryotic cells, as I say, lead to these multicellular forms. And something which I'm really interested in but haven't had a chance to do much research into at the moment is that at some point gender did become a thing. And this is purely from the scientific perspective. Self-replication was no longer possible for these eukaryotic cells and for multicellular organisms because they were large volumes of them, and so the requirement came in for self-replication to be done in a different format. And this is obviously where human mating, for instance, is a great example. We create in males sperm cells, and females create ovums or egg cells. And when we mate, these sperm and eggs contain half of the genetic constitution of each of the individuals, and upon these two distinct gametes meeting, the egg essentially provides a huge store of metabolic energy for initial reactions to take place. I presume while it's during the formation of the placenta and so on and so forth. And eventually cell division occurs. One zygote, if you will, which is the form of when the sperm meets the egg and fuses together. So this zygote splits into two, and then the two splits into four, and the four splits into eight. So going back to the flower of life, we now have our 8 cells, and these 8 cells, the third division post-zygote formation, is known as the blastula. And this is actually the source of the stem cells within our bodies. Obviously, after development through adolescence occurs, these stem cells essentially become adult somatic cells, as they're known, and they can no longer create all the different types of cell in the body. They can only create specific cells to which they're a part of. So essentially you'll have one that deals with blood, one that deals with muscular tissue, and so on and so forth. But in the early days, these cells can pretty much create any form of cell. And we still don't understand the mechanics truly behind the differences between embryonic stem cells and adult somatic cells. But either way, that's something that I will look into myself and get back to you on at a later point. So this blastula is essentially the same shape as the flower of life if you were to take it from a two-dimensional form into the three-dimensional form that the blastula actually is. It represents the same thing, and it provides a possible template for the expansion of all forms of life, therefore, because if we can see it within ourselves, and we can see it within all of the mammals and so on and so forth, as well as plants, then the likelihood is that we're going to be able to see this elsewhere. And of course, this, as I've already mentioned, is based on phi ratio, which is known as God's fingerprint in the Hermetic traditions. So, as I've already mentioned, this relates to the tree of life, and Platonic solids can be derived from this as well. And the Platonic solids were always given an element which specifically applied to the same elements that are applied to points on the pentagram. So I'm not going to delve into that at this point, but I just thought that was something that was quite interesting. So leading on from there, physicists are nowadays acknowledging the fact that geometry is absolutely pivotal to the further understanding and study of quantum mechanics in general / special relativity, which also has ties to early astrology and alchemy, as alchemy is more looking at chemical structure as well as psychological structure of things, and astrology is looking at personality and kind of fatalistic approaches to how our lives are going to proceed, as well as, of course, the study of the sky, of the cosmos, of the stars. So now we're beginning to see a direct, indisputable link between religious doctrine and scientific understanding, because geometry is inherent within those first entries within the Bible, and it's also inherently obvious to science now that geometry plays an absolutely pivotal part in the creation of life and in the actual execution of the forces and the very nature to which the world works. So just to give you a few more examples of phi within the body, it's in the proportions of the hand and the arm. The phalanges, the metacarpals and carpals are all abiding by phi proportions, and these are your finger bones essentially. So if you curl your hand into a fist, you can see the Fibonacci spiral itself from the tip of the finger, running round to the knuckle and then round to the thumb. And you can also see this if you lay your hand out and you put your fingers all together and your thumb by the side. You can actually see that if we follow from the middle finger to the ring finger, and then from the ring finger to the index finger, and then from the index finger to the pinky, and then from the pinky to the thumb, the same ratio, abiding 5 proportions, if you will, can always be seen. Now, obviously, the distance changes, but we're talking about proportion here. So proportion is the same kind of scale. It's scaling up in terms of the distance between your ring finger and your middle finger and your ring finger is smaller than the distance between and the differentiation between the ring finger and the index finger, but it is essentially the same shape that you're making, you're just extrapolating out. And there are examples of this in various books you can find. I'll have to find a link to those particular sources and provide that at a later point. But we can also see this in snail shells and nautilus shells. We can see this in butterflies. We can see this in plants, and we can indeed see this in all of nature. In terms of plants, we see it with the way that they grow. The nodes, if you will, from where the stems offshoot is always based on phi, and you can actually follow it around. And a pine cone is another great example. If you follow it diagonally across, you can actually see how it spirals round the I don't know what they're called actually, but essentially the bits that break off and act as seeds. Those aspects, if you follow them round, they essentially make this phi ratio very obvious. So as I mentioned before, form defines function, and many animals share homogeneous traits. So if we just look at a few, whales have inside of their fins bone structures that are very, very similar to the human hand, much different in terms of the length, but the proportions are the same, and they have 5 essentially. They have 5 fingers, a thumb and 4 fingers. Though obviously they don't, their form is different, specifically for the function that it provides, which is as a fin. Bats, their wings have the same format as the hands of a human, and indeed most mammals have similar underlying morphological traits, which are derived from an original precursor, i.e. a template, if you will. And this is the study of homogeny. So moving past that anyway, going on to DNA, because we've looked into RNA. DNA is essentially an energy-containing code, the energy being light, as Dan Winter has pointed out. And this is actually believed to be affected, the DNA that is directly affected by emotion in terms of successful replication. Expression, on the other hand, i.e. the creating of all protein-based molecules that we use within our body, so hormones, which are essentially just messages that tell things to switch on and switch off genetically, enzymes which are utilised to break down food and extract the energy in the forms of ATP and NADH, as well as the precursors for glycoconjugates, which I'm not going to get into for now, but these are essentially structural and communicative saccharides, so then sugars that aren't involved in fueling your body. All of these are created through the expression of protein. So DNA serves a purpose in terms of it tells the body how to grow by producing proteins that direct the genetics of other cells. It also creates the requirements to sustain the body, and so on and so forth. And therefore, this is a huge amount of information contained and compacted within the DNA. And it's very, very unreactive in its condensed form. However, it can be unzipped and uncondensed, if that's a word, by the very thing it creates. DNA helicase, which is the enzyme that unzips it, if you will, and allows for RNA to be produced, is an enzyme. So there is this feedback loop. So I was going to discuss glycomics, which is a relatively new branch of science, and it shows much more advanced expression methods than proteomics essentially does. And same with DNA in essence, because of the fact that glycomics doesn't really provide us with any template for how these glycoconjugates are created. It seems very random. Very similar looking forms will do completely opposite things, and there is very little understood about it at the time, at this moment in time, sorry, but I will probably cover that at a later point in time, but otherwise this video could go on for quite some time. So discussing the karyotype now, which is essentially the number of chromosomes within a cell. The karyotype of the human shows what are often deemed contradictions to popular science. There are solid arguments on both sides, but one of the most disputed things is that our fellow primates have 24 pairs of chromosomes, resulting in 48 individual chromosomes, whilst we only have 23 pairs, which equates to 46 chromosomes. The thing is that our common ancestor has 24 as well, which means there was a fusing, and scientists are aware of this now. There's been some work done into this by, I believe it was Ken Miller, who noted that chimpanzee DNA, when it was checked, seems to show that the chromosome 2 in the human karyotype is actually two distinct chromosomes within the chimpanzee that have joined together. Now, the reasoning for this could be down to many other things. I mean, there are natural reasons why chromosome 2 in humans could have conjoined together, but this doesn't denote that there are possibilities of interference, which I will get into at a later point. So it's important to note that a lot of the time we think that the number of chromosomes indicates advanced nature of things. So the more chromosomes you have, the more advanced you will be. That isn't true. I mean, there are plants, for instance, the moonworts have 45 pairs of chromosomes, which is 90 individual chromosomes. Yet they're a plant. I mean, they can't even move on their own. They are a stationary organism. So the number of chromosomes isn't important, especially bearing in mind that the majority of our DNA is deemed junk by scientists. So it's not so important, but the thing that I do find that's interesting, as I say, is that our common ancestor has more chromosomes than us, and all of our kind of cousins, if you will, gorillas, chimpanzees, so on and so forth, also possess the same number as our ancestor, and we don't. So going on to more about the brain structure. Many species of mammals possess the neocortex, but as we know, it's most developed within humans. And we generally deem, once again, that this is what leads to humans being of such a superior intellect and superior capability. However, there have been studies, for instance, Dick et al., i.e. Dick and others, did a study in 2008 which and wrote an article off the back of it suggesting that the neocortex might not actually be as integral to intelligence as we first thought, as many animals with much less formed neocortexes exhibit highly intelligent behaviours. I, however, would argue the fact that whilst there are animals that exhibit highly intelligent behaviour, we do tend to find that it would take a number of different animals to be kind of conjoined for them to have the same level of intellect as we have. And tying this in with hermeticism once again, particularly tying in the consideration of their ideas, there's a possibility that the reason for us being so much more developed as a species is that we have access to a higher consciousness due to additional faculties held by our much more advanced neocortex. Essentially, the way I perceive it is almost as though our brain is acting as a receptor to the transmission of these higher consciousness, these omniscient, omnipresent ideologies discussed within the Bible, intuition being the main method for the expression of this phenomenon. Now, admittedly, there are many creatures that have highly intuitive faculties. Turtles, for instance, have been found to essentially sink in to the electromagnetic field of the planet itself, and they can use this as a form of GPS system. Obviously, there are animals, quite a wide array of animals, in fact, that can generally sense weather changes when humans require a weather vane and various other bits of equipment to do so. So I would contrast to Dick and the other colleagues of his who did their study in 2008 that whilst I will openly admit that there are highly intelligent animals, they tend to be highly intelligent in only one or two fields in comparison to that of humans, who have a much more powerful neocortex and therefore a greater ability to receive or ascertain greater knowledge, up to and including consciously questioning their own existence. Now, admittedly, once again, we don't know that animals don't question their reality. They may well do, but our language faculties are so much greater than theirs are. Um, our ability to create tools has allowed us to outsurvive many, many, many forms of creature that could quite easily predate on us in terms of their forms. We don't have any inbuilt weaponry really in terms of our physical structure, but we found ways to create weaponry and tools that will allow us to do things that animals can just do because of the form that they exist in. So moving on to that and within the same vein, now I want to discuss differences between ourselves and our ancestors, as well as our cousins, if you will. So much of the skeletal structure between our closest ancestors, particularly the ancestors along the lines of, because obviously we know many of our ancestors now, but we also know that there may be gaps. And I'm aware of this fact, that we may have intermediates that are missing from carbon dating and so on and so forth, and from the fossil record. However, there are big questions pertaining to the skeletal structure of our species itself. If you look at the skull shape, the form of the hands and the legs, the spinal column, we note that the bone structure in general of humans is considerably weaker than many of our ancestors. The bones are much lighter and thinner. The muscular structure is between 5 and 10 times weaker. Our skin is not adapted to sunlight. We have much less body hair, which leads us to have to make garments once again with our advanced brains. We have made clothing to protect ourselves from the many elements that exist. And we ourselves are capable of a much greater degree of language, and our throat's function is much greater than gorillas, than orangutans, than chimpanzees, so on and so forth, as well as our ancestors. So there's also a huge volume of genetic disorders within humanity, so much so that the pharmaceutical industry is thriving and probably will thrive for as long as it exists. And all of these examples were given by Lloyd Pye, to which has been often used as an example, his studies that is, to dispute the idea of evolution, which, as I say, I personally do believe evolution is possible. However, we haven't seen any real examples of macroevolution. What we have seen are large volumes of microevolutionary adaptations, which when compounded imply macroevolution, which I personally deem a misnomer, as microevolutionary changes can result in quite extreme phenotypic differentiation, and a phenotype, or phenotype I should say, sorry, is essentially the expression of a gene. So, for instance, the horse family Equidae have undergone quite a large volume of changes. Some of their earliest ancestors resembled dogs more than obviously their current form that they preside in, i.e. horses, and many of the other cousins, if you will, so donkeys and so on and so forth, they resemble much more like dogs back in their most common ancestors. However, this may just as viewing this as macroevolution, because many scientists argue that macroevolution has been seen. I personally don't think it has, and it's also important to note that even though we still understand that natural selection as a theory is probably the most accurate we're going to get, at least at this point in time, it's really the only relevant part of the origin of species that remains. Darwin has been pretty much found to be incorrect on many of his other propositions throughout the origin of species itself. So there is a huge possibility that genetic engineering as a form of intervention could have actually taken place. And this, going back to some of the things I was discussing earlier, really begins to take form because we can see that DNA itself, I mean, we can see that DNA could have evolved quite easily from RNA. That's indisputable, and I do believe that that is what happened. I do believe that DNA already existed from a long time ago, and I don't think that there was any direct intervention from anything there. But I do believe that there's a possibility, bearing in mind the karyotype, and bearing in mind the great variation in difference between our ancestors and ourselves, as well as our cousins. Our cousins and our ancestors sharing much more similarity than we do. And knowing all of these things, we ourselves are now actually experimenting with the knowledge that I've already discussed. We've created a much more stable form of genetic material called XNA. It's got a greater compact nature to it. It can be compacted and condensed to a much greater degree. It's triple-stranded, and of course the stranding of DNA itself actually is based on phi. A helix follows phi proportions. We're now dealing with genetic engineering, GM crops, so on and so forth are a big topic of discussion at the moment within the scientific community as well as the global populace. Many people disputing GM crops shouldn't be propagated and shouldn't be allowed to be included in our food chain. Cloning has been something that we've been experimenting with quite some time. Hybridization and phenotypic selection through artificial selection is something we've been doing for hundreds of years. We turned wolves into dogs. We domesticated wolves, essentially. There's also discussions of the possibility of terraforming other planets, because we know that we're destroying our own planet. Biological warfare is something that we've also, unfortunately, started work on, and has been going on probably since the 1960s, maybe even before. Obviously, a lot of the knowledge surrounding that will be hidden from the general populace. Direct and indirect mind control has been utilised. Indirectly, media control and social engineering, in particular, are extreme examples that we're aware of. But there are also the speculation of the MK Ultra and Monarch programs as well that were supposedly headed up by the CIA in America. So all of these things that we're experimenting with are based on proportionation systems, as well as the principles of biochemistry and genetics, and of course the principles of psychology in relation to mind control. So I'm going to cut it at this point for now, because I've realised how long I've been going on for on this particular video. So in the next video, I'm going to discuss possible and proposed theories regarding intervention, with regards to obviously our ancestors and therefore ourselves. I'm going to discuss the Garden of Eden story in particular, as well as Sumerian texts that have been used by many of these examples to actually propose how we have been influenced as a species. I'm also going to discuss the Atlantis arguments, as well as the Lemurians, who are directly linked to the Atlanteans and their civilization. And I'm also going to discuss the stone ape theory of evolution proposed by Terence McKenna versus hand-eye coordination, which is currently popular within the scientific community as an argument for the development of the human brain over such a short period of time. So I'm going to cut it there for now, and I'm just going to leave you with, obviously, my sort of conclusion for this part is that whilst I tend to align myself more with the scientific principles on this part, I also align myself with many of the Hermetic points, and I do believe that there is a huge crossover between both religion and science in terms of our origins and the origins of the universe. So I think it's almost impossible to discern the whole truth at present, because of the degree of research that's been done in so many different fields, and obviously the allegorical language used by religious and occultic doctrines. However, bear in mind at all times, I don't necessarily believe anything as 100% verbatim. I think it's foolish to essentially assume something is correct when we don't have the full knowledge, and particularly I think Darwin is a prime example of why that's a good reason, because so many people have sworn by Darwin over the years and what Darwin discovered, and in the last few years it's become blindingly apparent that Darwin was actually wrong on a number of things. So the theory of evolution is just that. It's a theory. It's a very good model for building an understanding as to where we've come from. And obviously the Hermetic principles are also a good place to kind of ground your ideas with regards to how these mechanisms occurred in the first place. But as I say, the next video should cover a bit more as to how I think we have been misled in certain ways. And then the final video within this, or the final sets of videos, I don't know how long they're going to take me, because at the moment I only originally intended to do 3 videos, but it looks like it's going to be at minimum 4. We'll discuss human history from a more modern perspective, so going back to somewhere around the 1500s, as well as discussing the civilizations of Egypt prior to, and Rome and Greece as well. And then start discussing about the direct situation we find ourselves in as a species at the moment in time. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Please critique and let me know if I've given any misinformation, because I'm trying to avoid misinforming. But yeah, feel free to comment, subscribe, and of course, if you have any disagreements with anything I say, feel free to let me know, and I will address those accordingly.